Hello and welcome to The Link with me, Amir Arfa. What's in a name? A revolution, an uprising, or simply an awakening? The Arab world has been afire for the past 3.5 months. Thousands killed, thousands more injured. 2 dictators deposed, others grasping at every single bayonet to stay on. Foreign powers bombing Libya as we speak. And for that and more, we're joined from London by Gumal Al-Gamati, a Libyan writer, political commentator, from Washington, D.C., by Webster Tarpley, author, journalist, and lecturer. Philadelphia, Daniel Pipes, founder and director of the Middle East Forum. From Beirut, by Hilal Khashan, professor at the American University of Beirut. We're also joined from Beirut and London. Our panels of audience who are simply waiting for us to go to. Let's go straight to London. But let's start with Gumal Al-Gamati, they're telling me, a Libyan writer, political commentator. Now, we have Libya, and further down the show we will be discussing Libya, but is it right to have a monolithic approach to simply naming what's happening on the ground in the Arab world?
I characterize it as the Arab nation, the Arab people awakening at last, saying enough is enough. We had enough of tyranny, we had enough of totalitarianism, we had enough of despotism, we had enough of corruption, we had enough of lack of freedom, we had enough of gross violations of human rights, and we want freedom, we want justice, we want equality, we want democracy, and we want prosperity. We want to join the democratic world, we want to join the rest of the world, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in post-Eastern Europe. Everybody, over the last 20 years, countries have been joining the democratic club every year. The only region in the world which has been suffering from a democracy deficit is the Arab world. Some people thought that the Arab world will never come to democracy, but now the people of the Arab world are proving all these commentators and academics wrong. The Arab world is rising and is joining democracy and is proving that they are just as healthy and vibrant as the rest of the world.
Now, Hilal Khashan in Beirut, how would you characterize the past 3 months? Why now? 2010, 2011, all of a sudden, all the dominoes are falling. Why now, and what's happening?
Well, the Arab world seems to have a very strong central nervous system. Eventually it happened somewhere, and the effect has been tremendous. You know, all it took for the Arabs to rally behind the cause of political reform and change, and in their effort to put an end to absolute regime, it was sufficient for a young Tunisian man to set himself on fire to send a powerful message across the Arabic-speaking world. So this is what we're happening, what we are having right now. Emotions, feelings that were pent up for years and years eventually came to the force, and it erupted just like a volcano. This was a natural development. All it needed was the right moment and the proper and the correct incident, if I may say.
The right moment, but the right moment happened in, well, December of 2010, and let's ask Webster Tarpley in Washington. Washington, D.C. was scratching its head, simply saying, well, the intelligence community was asking the president, well, did you know it was coming? The president was accusing, well, I wasn't really informed. The intelligence community shooting back, well, we saw it coming, especially when it came to Egypt, but did you see this coming, Webster?
I think I did to some extent, but let me correct a very fundamental misconception in what you've just said. Don't look at the words coming out of the mouth of somebody like Obama. This is very irrelevant in many ways. What counts is covert action, as in CIA covert action by the intelligence community. What you're dealing with is a wave of color revolutions or people power coups, more or less on the model that we've seen in Ukraine or in Georgia, attempted in Lebanon and failed, attempted in Belarus and failed. This is the usual methodology of the National Endowment for Democracy. And instead of democracy, what you're getting, obviously, in Tunisia, you had a military coup arranged behind the scenes with a bunch of street demonstrations, but of course the essence of it was a putsch. It was a palace coup or putsch by a group of generals. Similarly, in Egypt, people who were in that Tahrir Square thought that they were getting themselves the singing tomorrows of democracy, and instead what they now have is a military dictatorship of Tantawi and this military junta. In Libya, the merit of Gaddafi, I think, is that by resisting, he has stripped away the rhetoric and the fatuous slogans about democracy and human rights and all the rest of it. Underneath all that rhetoric, you have cruise missiles, you have predator drones, you have imperialism. And anything that's going to qualify as a revolution in the Arab world would have to address the imperialism of the International Monetary Fund, of the World Bank, of the World Trade Organization, and above all, of NATO. The reason for these things is that the U.S. empire is in a crisis, and the desire of the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community is to overthrow satraps, overthrow the viceroys or khedives of the empire because they're too autonomous. Mubarak was able to say no when the U.S. said, we want bases, we want troops in Iraq, we want troops in Afghanistan. Mubarak said no to all of that. Gaddafi was somebody who could say no. He kicked out Occidental Petroleum and Chevron Oil last autumn. He was not taking orders in the way that a good satrap or khedive of Libya is supposed to do. So the goal of all of this is to replace relatively stable, entrenched autocratic regimes, certainly, with a greater degree of autonomy, with new puppet regimes that will be much weaker, or indeed chaos.
Now,
warlords, tribalism, the descent into criminal enterprise.
Now, Mr. Tarpley,
that's the CIA program.
Let me get it straight from you, because there might be some confusion here. Are you suggesting that the things that happen in the Arab world, they were not spontaneous, they came from outside, or no, the control later on came from outside and they started, they tried to ride the wave? Which of these two are you? You
can compare this to the 1848 revolutions in Europe against Metternich and the Holy Alliance. The grievances are obviously real, but when there are economic grievances, and these are fundamental, you should be looking to Wall Street speculators. You should be looking to zombie banks and hedge fund hyenas. The ability of Gaddafi or Mubarak or Ben Ali to control their economies is very limited. Indeed, Gaddafi's fundamental mistake was to go into this IMF privatization program in 2003, privatizing the state sector. He went from basically zero unemployment to 20%, and that was his fatal weakness. So yes, and the entire thing, of course, was triggered by a CIA limited hangout operation known as WikiLeaks, which targeted Ben Ali, targeted Gaddafi, and did this work in a rather effective way.
Let's go to Daniel Pipe, see if he agrees. Daniel?
Thank you. Well, we've had two very contrasting explanations, one from Mr. Gamati, who sees it as the expression of Arab peoples finding their voice, their democratic voice, and then Mr. Griffin, who sees it as essentially a CIA conspiracy. I'm somewhere in between. I certainly don't see it as a CIA conspiracy. I do see it as truly the Arab voice. But on the other hand, I am skeptical that it's going to lead to profound changes. As we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt, there's a lot more continuity than change. Now, I think in Yemen, should the government be overthrown, there will be true profound change. But elsewhere, I don't see that coming. I think there is more likely to be continuity of tyranny than a true Arab Spring and democracy. I hope I'm wrong, but so far the signs are not terribly encouraging. It looks like the old guard. I know Egypt better than Tunisia. Egypt, let me just spend a second on Egypt. Egypt has been under military rule since 1952. A coup d'etat by the free officers in 1952 brought the military to power. There have been three major leaders in that time: Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak. We now have a fourth military leader, Tantawi. It doesn't look like he nor his colleagues are ready to change that much. They're willing to acknowledge the spirit of Tahrir Square, willing to make concessions, but it looks very much like they intend to stay in power. And I would be surprised if the Muslim Brotherhood or any other force is able, at least in the short run, to dislodge them. So I see more continuity than change. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there is a spirit of democracy that prevails, but I think at this point we have in most Arab countries we have, it's going to look a year from now not so different from the way it did a year ago.
And that's the big question. But let's go with that question to Beirut and our panel of audience. Now, we have contrasting ideas here. Well, spontaneous or orchestrated, the movements in the Arab world, the uprising, the revolutions. Then change or continuity. But first, let's take a look at spontaneous, orchestrated, how you guys characterize it. You're in the midst of all of this in Beirut.
Well, if you start with Tunisia was a bit not orchestrated for sure. It was a bit spontaneous. After the Bouazizi martyr, that he put his whole body on fire. In this case, this was a bit spontaneous, and the people were, deprived of their own human rights. High rise of corruption, unemployment rates were really high, and the youth opportunities for jobs inside Tunisia was a bit too high. So the situation was a bit of not only the dignity of Al-Bouazizi when this all started with an officer inside the streets of Tunisia, but the dignity of all the Arab populations and the youth inside the Arab states such as Egypt. And then the successful revolution inside Egypt by the youth did perpetrate or orchestrated the new revolutions after after this, what happened inside Libya and then Yemen and Bahrain, let's say, and it's like a drama, or it's not a dilemma, but it's like a game. It's not a puzzle anymore. Everything is being unveiled by the people. The truthful honesty of the people have been widespread on the streets.
Basically, I agree that these are definitely the spontaneous movements of people on the street. And while I'm also a critic of American imperialism and colonialism, it would be absolutely ridiculous to say that Americans or Europeans or any power outside of the Arab populations are in control of these wonderful revolutions, people demonstrating peacefully on the streets, demanding for their rights. Obviously, there are imperialist interests that we shouldn't ignore. We should look at the closed-door meetings, the private diplomacy happening outside of the peaceful demonstrations in the streets. But just to say that this is imperialism really takes away from the agency of the people who are bravely facing bullets, they're facing stones, they're facing tear gas, they're facing such violence. And to say that they're not actually doing this of their own accord is absolutely continuing an imperialist agenda, not criticizing it. So I think we should be applauding what's going on all throughout the Arab countries at the moment, and really, support them however we can, but really just watch and be inspired really by what they're doing.
Now let's go to London and see what our audience in London, the panel of audience, what you guys have been getting from all of this. You've been receiving a lot of gory pictures and images on TV, simply blood flowing in the Middle East, the Arab world. Now we have the UN Security Council on, but what is it, the sense you're getting from what's happening in the Arab world? What is happening?
I would like to mention a point on everyone's topic. I think it is interesting the timing of how all this is happening, and perhaps related to the rate of all these governments changing, maybe somehow related to the correspondent was saying in Washington. Is it somehow related to WikiLeaks or not? It's basically the internet is playing an important factor through, for example, Facebook and Twitter, organizing people to do different protests and things like that. So the power of internet is coming into how the world, global geopolitical stuff is changing. So, I mean, whether it's going to be for the best or worse, only time will tell. That's my point.
All right, could you pass the mic?
Well, first of all, if you look at the Libyan situation, it's not in the Libyan people's interest for a US presence or a NATO presence in their country. And it's not in the Libyan people's, it's not what they want in the country either. They never asked for any American or any Western intervention into their country. What we need to do is just step back from the actual situation and let them deal with it.
All right, on the international reaction to what's been happening, the 1973 resolution by the UN, and finally the intervention, first the US led one, and then US simply going into the background, handing it over to NATO. Now, London, what do you think about international reaction to what's happening on the ground in the Middle East, and now particularly in Libya?
Yes. First of all, let me explain that the 1973 resolution, Security Council resolution on Libya, stipulates no ground invasion and no occupation of Libya, only in, protecting civilians by all necessary measures from air, from distance. So the Libyan people will never accept ground troops. That is the first thing. The second thing is, you cannot say that we should not do anything in Libya and leave the people to get on with it by themselves, because unlike Tunisia and Egypt, in Libya we have this mad despot spinning out of control who've decided to wage a total war against his own people and kill as many as possible. In the last nearly 6 weeks, he has killed over 10,000. So there is a moral and a legal duty and responsibility by the international community to intervene and protect the Libyan population. Otherwise, there will be a huge massacre in Africa, possibly another Rwanda in North Africa. So there the community can just watch and sit by. That is as far as the Libyan situation is concerned. May I just also go back to something that has been said by your guest from Washington, which is really indicative of how some people are totally detached and even ignorant about what's going on in the Middle East, when they attribute everything that has been happening to a conspiracy theory, to a CIA plot. This is really insulting and demeaning to the young Arab populations across the whole of the Middle East. Nearly 75% of the Arab populations are under the age of 30. Let me give you another statistic. In Tunisia, the number of young Tunisians who are on Facebook per capita is higher than that of Germany. The young Arab populations are vibrant, they are educated, they are on Twitter, they are on Facebook, they are on the internet, they have the same aspirations like any other young person across the globe. They want to be free, they want to live in justice, they want to fulfill their potential and express themselves politically, economically, culturally, and everything. So they have the same aspirations for democracy and justice like everybody else. And to suggest that somehow the Arab people are inept, are incapable of achieving democracy as if they lack this democracy gene is really insulting. Now, this is typical of some Western commentators who are totally detached from this world.
Let's get Webster's reaction to this. Go at Washington.
Suppose you have a color revolution in Syria. We heard the word dignity before. In Syria, we have Dignity Day, Dignity Square, the Dignity Movement. Where does that slogan come from? Dignity is the main slogan of Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book about what has to happen with the youth bulge. And what I'm stressing is that dignity doesn't have much role for trade union rights, for economic development, for kicking out the International Monetary Fund, for declaring a debt moratorium, for maintaining a state sector. The giveaway on a lot of this stuff is that the economic demands are so vague, and we're left with these rather generic demands about human rights. Concerning whether this is demeaning, I think you have to look at it quite realistically. We had a lot of young people in the United States who were completely duped by Obama in 2008. That's just the way it works. Conspiracy theory. Let's look at the leadership of those Libyan rebels. Let's look at the people who are running the city of Darna right now. We have two people who are essentially connected or members of Al-Qaeda. They're from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Two of them were prisoners of war of the U.S., one in Guantanamo and one in Pakistan, where he was a fighter. Now, these people were delivered back into the field to do operations against Gaddafi. And I'm talking about Mr. Hasidi and Mr. Kumi. The Al-Qaeda component of the Libyan rebels, I think, is a very big story. I don't share a lot of the U.S. government mythology about Al-Qaeda, but I think it is very unwise to put such people in command of a city. Look at that Darna City Council and tell me what the story is. I would say the challenge to people in the Middle East is, you got rid of Mubarak, okay. But now, if that was the February revolution, where's the October revolution? Where's something that actually is going to change something, not just go from the dictatorship of Mubarak to the dictatorship of Tantawi?
All right,
but
now
go to some situation where you
Tarpley,
get an economic program.
We have 5 minutes left at the end of the first half, so I want to go to Hilal Khashan in Beirut. Hilal, still talking whether it's spontaneous from outside, whatever. Of course, we have foreign forces simply busy as we speak, bombing positions in Libya. But now the question is, what's in it for who? What are the stakes and for who? Now, we are witness to a United States to simply saying, all right, I'm going into the background, I'm taking my planes out, whatever. Simply, we have NATO members a divisive NATO simply. We have Europeans at one another's throat with simply Italians saying we get the refugees, the French get the oil, so on and so forth, and we have a spontaneous movements on the ground. So what are the stakes and what's in it for who?
Uprisings do not mean taking an anti-Western and, to be specific, an anti-American stand. Revolutionaries want reform at home. They want to improve the quality of governance. Let me be clear about it. An uprising does not mean immediate transition to democracy. The transition to democracy is a protracted process that may take decades, if not more. So let's not have delusions and illusions about an immediate transition to democracy. Let's take oil, for example. The Libyans, whether under Gaddafi or anybody else, they will be selling oil. I don't understand, I don't believe that any Arab country wants to be on bad terms with the US. Maybe they want to improve the quality of relationship with the West. So the question is not who will win, who will gain out from this uprising. What I have here is that the people are fed up with the regimes, the people are demanding change. Now, the guest from Washington said that people are talking about dignity and said this is a CIA. He referred this to the Carter years. Yes, I mean, if you live in many Arab countries, you know, if you live under brutal regimes, if you live under dictatorships who violate the population, then dignity becomes a salient matter, and people there do not really need to get such definitions from a Western type dictionary. So what we have at stake right here is a massive movement for change. People want change. Change does not mean eroding relations with the West. Actually, I am of the opinion that transition in the Arab world, the empowerment of the people, to the extent the West and the military establishments are willing to calibrate it, that will reflect positively on Arab-American and Arab-Western relations.
All right, now, we have to take a break. Well, when we come back, a lot of questions still. What's at stake? What is to come out of all of this? Freedom, democracy, autocracy, what? Change or continuity? And of course, Washington's role in all of this. Is the world witness to a post-American world? And what would Arabs do in a post-American world? Stay with us. We're back with the link discussing 3 months of ongoing revolutions in the Arab world. Thousands killed, thousands injured, 2 dictators deposed, others grasping at every single bayonet to survive. But then again, change or continuity, and what's to come out of this, and of course, Washington's role in all of this. For that and more, we're joined from London by Gamal Gamati, Libyan writer, political commentator; from Washington by Webster Tarpley, author, journalist, and lecturer; from Philadelphia, Daniel Pipes, founder and director of the Middle East Forum; from Beirut by Hilal Khashan, professor at American University of Beirut; and of course, our panels of audience in London and Beirut. But I'd like to start this time around with Philadelphia. Daniel Pipes, you heard them all. And now the question, international reaction to all of this. We talked about the CIA, so on and so forth. But there is another thing people are talking about. Farid Zakaria's book, Post-American World, is the thing that's happening in Libya. Americans counting their pennies back home, saying we can't even afford it. A sign of times to come, a post-American world. America is simply one of the players, not the major superpower, the sole superpower of the world.
Great question. But before I get to it, could I just comment on the discussions taking place?
Go ahead.
I've written 2 books on conspiracy theories. And so this is a subject that interests me. And I've seen the Middle East traditionally as the most conspiracy-minded part of the world. And so I'm delighted to watch as Middle Easterners say no to an American conspiracy theorist who says this is all made in Washington. They're saying, no, it's not made in Washington, we're doing it. I'm delighted by that. I think it's very healthy. I think it's a sign of a real change that's underway. And part of the reason why I've got more optimism about the region than I had just 3-4 months ago. As to your question, is this a post-American world? Well, there certainly is going to be less money available for a foreign policy, especially for military purposes. But at the same time, I think what you're seeing now has less to do with money and more to do with the nature of the current administration, the Obama administration, and particularly a figure in it named Samantha Powers has a very different approach from the, say, traditional approach of either Bush's or Clinton or predecessors. And so this is less post-American, I think, than an experiment. An experiment in having the United States be just one of the governments, not be the leader, but be just one of the guys. I call it the United States pretending to be Belgium. We'll see. Is this going to work? Is it not going to work? But it's definitely an experiment, and I suspect it's not a very long-lasting experiment. I don't think we've entered into a post-American world.
Now, let's go to Washington. Webster Tarpley. When we talk about these dictators in the Arab world, we're talking people who have been in power for the past 3-4 decades. And that goes as far back as the Nixon administration back at this stage. And then there is one point that all of these also share, and that is support coming from the U.S. Well, at times, support has been coming from elsewhere, like Libya, for example, at some point receiving support from Russia. But then again, many of these monarchs, dictators, kings, whatever the name, they've been receiving support, all kinds of support from Washington. Now, all of a sudden, we hear Washington saying things like, all right, even President Saleh, it's perhaps time to go. So how do you see this? And if you say Washington has been arranging for this to happen, why all of a sudden going from supporting the dictators to saying, maybe, no, the people?
I think it's a question of a crisis of the Anglo-American empire, to be sure. These authoritarian figures, some of them dictators that you're talking about, have been supported by the United States in the past, but today they are being dumped, and this is quite obvious. And whether Obama endorses it or whether he hangs back means very little. It's what's being done covertly on the ground, right? The CIA, of course, has a $40 billion budget as a neocon, like Professor Pipes certainly knows. The crisis of the empire takes the following form. Under the U.S. empire, there is no economic development. There's only IMF conditionality, deregulation, privatization, the race to the bottom, and so forth. These countries rightly want economic development. Now, in order to get economic development, in order to have autonomy and the dignity that comes from national independence, they've got to go to either Russia or China, or some of them go to Iran, or some of them, like Turkey, attempt to build themselves up through various alliances. We just take an example or two. Who's playing the Russian card in the Middle East? Well, Gaddafi had invited in the Russians to build a railroad along the coast and to provide some air defense, which would prevent the Libyan people from being bombed by NATO Predator drones today. There was a group in Saudi Arabia around Prince Bandar that was interested in playing the Russian card in order to balance the overweening presence of the United States, the complete subjugation. In the case of the China card, that's basically everybody in Africa. Gaddafi had 40,000 Chinese workers in Libya doing a lot of the oil work, which the Anglo-Americans do not want. Algeria today has about 40,000 Chinese workers, and they're building all sorts of things. The big one, of course, is Pakistan, massively playing the Chinese card. And we may be very close to some very ugly developments between the United States and Pakistan, even as we speak. Mubarak, as I say, was attempting to open up a dialogue with Iran. Instead of having the Egypt and Iran constantly at loggerheads, he wanted to find some kind of a constructive solution. The general idea, I think you can see, is in Ivory Coast, because we not only had 175 of the UN Security Council, we had 173, and then we had 175 on the Ivory Coast. And you can see today a massacre of supporters of former President Gbagbo in Ivory Coast under the aegis of the United Nations, with the UN far from avoiding a massacre. They're actually taking part in the massacre of black Africans under this responsibility to protect, which has come up at least indirectly in the discussion. That responsibility to protect doctrine under humanitarian cover is a way to intervene in the internal affairs of basically every state on this planet. There are no more independent states, and it violates the UN Charter, which says that interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states is ruled out.
All right, now let's go to our panel audience in Beirut. Now the question is, for quite some time, for decades, it was Washington that stood behind many of the monarchs, many of the kings, many of the people who are right now perhaps shivering and trembling in their palaces in the Middle East, in the Arab world. Now, the question is, this very same Washington is right now changing tone, calling these guys, maybe it's time to go. Let me ask you about what you think on this flip-flop coming from Washington.
Actually, at the beginning, I would like to clarify a point. If we are going to discuss the Arab revolutions or what is going on as youth movements or the society movements in the Arab world, out of a panoramic view, we have to state a very important point that each revolution taking place in each Arab country is totally different from the other. There is a specificity that we have to respect and to deal with in order to be able to analyze what is going on and where what is going on will lead us to. For example, what has been achieved in Egypt and Tunisia while withdrawing the regime or the dictators that were ruling there actually triggered more the revolutions and the demonstrations in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Bahrain. But for example, if we take the example of Bahrain, we cannot say that in Bahrain revolution started after the success of the Tunisian and the Egyptian, because since 1999 and later on in 2005 and even recently, there were big demonstrations and strikes and movements for the protesters, for what they now, the regime in Bahrain called Shia protesters, although we know that there are liberal Sunnis that are supporting the political and rights of the people that are demonstrating and protesting in streets.
The issue is not the longing of the Arabic world for democracy. The issue is that there's no viable democratic opposition. What's likely to happen is that there's just going to be another layer of dictators.
I actually have a similar comment here. I would like to I really support the demonstrations and everything what is going on in Arab world at the moment. But is there any new elite which is coming out of it? If anyone can answer that to me.
All right, now let me take your question to Beirut and to Hilal Khashan. Hilal, earlier in the show, we had Daniel Pipe suggesting, well, we do not know what's coming out of this. This is pretty much what she was saying in London, that, okay, what is a change? Change or continuity? And now, again, back to the question of Washington at one point supporting all these dictators, and now they're saying, all right, go. Are we simply waiting for democracy to take hold in this region? Are we waiting for the people to find their voice in their politics?
Well, people gain politically to the extent that they apply themselves. In order for change to happen, we need to have social forces. There is no question in my mind that social forces are beginning to rise in the region. And the pattern is uniform and unmistakable. But again, let's not have great expectations about an immediate transition to democracy. We are in the beginning of a long process of change. Yes, change is happening, and I don't think it is up to the US or any other Western country to determine the fate of the region, because it is the extent to which the people are able to apply pressure and make their voices heard and sustain their endeavor. I think eventually they will get a major slice in the political arena. So it is a question of a movement that is beginning to unfold. And let's not be too jumpy to run into conclusions. I think we are just witnessing the initial stages of a major transformation.
Now, let me pose Daniel Pipe's question back to himself. Change or continuity? And at some point in time, after World War II, we had Washington orchestrating all of this, simply what was happening. We had a US-led West. Well, I think people would agree on that. Now, we have a U.S. that's saying, well, you say it's because it's Obama and partly because of the financial situation that is lurking into the background. The French, others are trying to take the lead. But then again, those cracks are becoming more ever evident between the European powers. Well, we have Russians and Chinese, on the other hand, that are kind of reluctant to all of this. And, well, they're watching all of this, and they're thinking, all right, we're the future of this. Now, what do you see when it comes to the power politics and this, the equations changing and this huge tectonic shift?
What are the power politics in the West vis-a-vis the Middle East? Well, what we are seeing, as you suggested, is the emergence of differences. The differences have been there before, say, on Iraq, but the U.S. government used to try to lead. It is conspicuously not trying to lead now, trying not to lead now. It is conspicuously trying to be just one of the Western powers. And that is, as I said before, I think an experiment. I'm not completely unsympathetic to it. There is a certain appeal to it. Back in 1997, for example, I wrote an article in which I argued that the United States should be more modest. Why is it we, who are always taking the lead at that time versus Saddam Hussein? Surely there are others who are closer to him and more vulnerable to him than we are. Why don't we wait for them to invite us to take the leadership? Why are we always asserting ourselves and going to the front of the line? So a somewhat more modest American foreign policy is not unattractive to me, though I think Obama is going too far in trying to make the United States a minor factor. This is a big country with a powerful economy, a powerful military, and more than that, a powerful ideology. The ideology of the United States has been, in large part, for a century now, since Woodrow Wilson, to promote democracy. Democracy was a very minor phenomenon a century ago, and it's been the American role, for example, in post-World War II Europe, to promote democracy. In Eastern Europe, in the 1970s, in East Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, and until 2003, not in the Middle East. It was George W. Bush, for all his faults, I disagree with much of what he did, who said, time to end with stability and move towards democracy. I do not give him credit for what has taken place in the last few months, but I do think that he set into motion policies for the U.S. government that will be long-lasting. And indeed, if you look closely at what Barack Obama has been saying vis-a-vis the changes in Tunisia and Egypt and the now civil war in Libya, you see words that could have come from George W. Bush. So there has been a change. There has been a change in the United States. Back in 2003, from stability towards democracy, and I think that is a factor, a minor factor, but still a factor in what's happened today.
Now, a lot of countries, a lot of protests, but let's focus on like one country, that being Libya at this point. And let's go to Gamal Gamati, a Libyan writer, political commentator. Gamal, the question is, what exactly is happening right now? Now, we've had 1973, the resolution by the UN. We've had bombings. We've had cries out there by China, Russia, and other international factors saying, you're killing people, civilians. This is simply uncalled for. We have reports that CIA operatives are on the ground helping the rebels. I don't know, to call them rebels, people, whatever the word. A lot of controversies over what to call them. And then arming them, training them, so on and so forth. We have people saying, since the U.S. pulled out, Gaddafi forces are gaining strength, and the international resolve is simply not there. So many divisions out there between the Europeans and NATO powers. Turkey trying to mediate, speak of some kind of a compromise between Gaddafi and the rebels, the so-called rebels. 3 countries are the only countries who have recognized the opposition at this point: Qatar, Italy, and France. So what exactly is happening, and what's coming out of all of this?
Okay, first of all, we have to remember that when the Libyan people started their peaceful demonstrations on the 17th of February, it was Gaddafi who chose to make this very violent and to start killing people indiscriminately en masse, unlike what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, where very few people were killed, and the army more or less played a neutral role. And for that reason, because of the bloody turn that Gaddafi made this revolution to, the international community had a responsibility to come and intervene and prevent the killings and protect civilians. The Libyan people are still on the same path. They are determined. There is a very strong resolve to carry on, pursue their revolution, to achieve the final objective for total regime change and to get rid of Gaddafi and his family, who have been in power for 42 years. Gaddafi has been the longest ruling dictator dictator in the world, 42 years. And the Libyan people will accept nothing less than Gaddafi and his sons totally leaving power. Now, the dynamics are changing, the momentum is changing. Now, Gaddafi has lost legitimacy, and the Libyan people have now got legitimacy through their interim council. It's been recognized officially by some countries, and it's been engaged with by many other countries, although there is no official recognition. There is no way back for Gaddafi, absolutely no way back for him and his sons. It's just a matter of time. The Libyan people are very strong in their resolve to pursue this to the end. It might be costly, it might be bloody, but they will not go back. There is no return, because large parts of Libya are now free. The whole of the east, Misrata, a whole region in the western mountain, they have tasted freedom. They have tasted what it is like to be free of 42 years of sheer tyranny and oppression. So there is no way of going back. Now, the international role is to protect Libyan people and to support them in achieving this legitimate objective. For me and for all Libyans, it is not if Gaddafi will leave power, it is just when. It might take few weeks, it might take a couple of months, but whatever it takes, the Libyan people are absolutely determined to stick with it and pursue it to the end, even if we lose much more lives. After all, 42 years of nothing, and now, you know, we have everything to go for. We have freedom to go for, we have justice, we have democracy, we have prosperity. Libya is a very wealthy country with a small population, very talented population. We have a very vibrant diaspora of 100,000. We can look forward to a great opportunity to rebuild the country on basis of constitutional, civil, democratic country, civil society, freedom, pluralism, elections, rule of law, all these things that will give the Libyan people have been totally disfranchised and marginalized for 42 years. Now is the chance for the Libyan people to be totally included, full participation politically, economically,
is that going to happen? Now, that's a question.
And utilize all the resources we have.
All right, but is that going to happen? Because that's a question I'm putting to Washington, Webster Tarpley. Webster, now, the London guest, he was talking about, all right, it's not a matter of when, if, it's a matter of when for Gaddafi to go. But there's too much in the air. Now, of course, when you look at the Americans, they're saying, all right, what are you going to do next? Who's going to end up with the power? We don't know. So we don't have a lot of stakes in there. When you look at the Europeans, they're fighting over it. The Italians are saying, French, you guys are going for the oil. We'll end up with the refugees. There's a lot of fight over that. On the ground, no one knows what's happening. Now, let me have your take on this. Where is this all leading to?
Well, Libya is now occupied by NATO. We've had NATO special forces, US, British, and French have been on the ground for more than a month, and they're now in there giving orders to the rebel army. I think the interesting question is the question of the new elites. If you think this is a revolution, and then you say Tantawi in Egypt and Jalil and Yunus in Libya are somehow a new elite, I don't think that will pass muster. Concerning Turkey, I think Turkey gets a place of honor. Erdogan, I believe, has been the one slowing down the massacre of Libyans by these NATO aircraft. We have fewer Predator drones, fewer AC-130 gunships over Libya, thanks to what the Turks have done. Syria. If the Syrian government falls to a color revolution, that will mean that Iran will have lost its main ally in the Middle East. Hezbollah will be completely isolated, and the Russians will be kicked out of the Tartus naval station. I think that's the goal there. In Egypt, the tradition is colonels replace generals. Now we even have a field marshal. The Nasser Free Officers Movement was an anti-imperialist movement, and what did they accomplish? They got the Suez Canal back for Egypt, and they built the Aswan High Dam, a tremendous achievement, the basis of modern Egypt. I'm wondering if there are nationalist colonels somewhere in the Egyptian military who are disgusted by Tantawi as a foreign puppet and who are thinking of precisely some kind of October or November second phase of this revolution to take it to some actual conclusion, rather than just having a weakened version of what you had before, a government in Cairo which is more dependent on the U.S., more obedient, more subjugated, which I think you have at the present time. The Obama policy is essentially, as Professor Pipes has usefully reminded us, the Obama policy is the continuation of Bush with other means. Under Bush, the presence of al-Qaeda was a reason to bomb, a reason to invade. Under Obama, we have the situation where al-Qaeda is used as the ground forces of NATO against the government of a UN member state. And this
all right, now we got less than 5 minutes.
We've got people recognizing that government. They've recognized the government where we don't know who half the people are. Are they members of Al-Qaeda? What is their story?
All right, we got less than 5 minutes. We want to see where all of this is actually going. Let's go to the audience in Beirut and let's ask them, where do you think this is going? Of course, different countries, different situations, but where is this going?
Well, first of all, let me say you were asking about democracy. We want to know the definition of democracy in Washington size. First of all, if we achieve democracy here in the Arab world, I don't think Washington is going to like it at all. Because first of all, it's definitely going to be against Israel, and Israel is their #1 concern. That's one thing. The other thing is about Egypt. It's a long story, but if I have a few minutes only, I need to talk a little bit about the Arab countries. Less than a minute. Well, I just wanted to say that up until the mid-1970s, see, Arab countries had coup d'etat all the time. But because the ruling elite back then, they didn't know what to do or how to control their people. But after 1975 and onwards, they actually came up with the propaganda of controlling their people by elaborating the control of media, the security of their civil society, and all of that. And of course, this paradigm happened for many, many years. And the fear of resistance actually made the people more oppressed, and they were so afraid of uprising. But right now, we're seeing people uprising. They're not afraid anymore. Of course, after Bouazizi's death.
Where would this go? Do you see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Yes, of course, definitely. I see it, and it's going to happen.
All right, could you please?
These dictators are going to go down one by one.
Let me see if others share your optimism in Beirut.
Yes, we do share her optimism in Beirut, for sure. I'd like to comment on the gentleman from Washington, if you would allow me, about the Al-Qaeda response inside Libya, for God's sake. I mean, this is a very important point, because some analysts, they've been saying that Al-Qaeda have been working hardly inside Libya in order for the international forces so that they can use it, or use it in order to make any plans in order to intervene with Tunisia and Egypt on the borders with Libya. Actually, could be an international conspiracy against the north continent of Africa.
We have less than a minute. We have less than a minute. We have less than a minute. Could you pass the mic? Where do you see the end of this, the end game?
I think at the end of the day, what we can wrap up with is that regional powers and players will always act to secure their interests, whether that's in America or in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia and others included, and that we'll have to wait and see what happens, and we need to move forward with cautionary optimism. As part of the Arab youth, we have to keep hoping that things will change for us and our future will be brighter, and we'll keep fighting for our rights, even though real politics will continue.
All right. Any more optimistic note out there?
I want to comment on to the Mr. in Washington. I want to say whatever happens, Hezbollah will not be isolated. He will be. They're always strong. They're always strong. Hezbollah will not be isolated. They will always be strong. Whatever happens. Okay, that's what I want to say.
All right. A lot of countries, a lot of controversies, a lot of protests. Thousands killed once again. Thousands injured. 2 dictators deposed, a lot more yet to come. No end in sight to what's happening on the streets. Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, Egypt, elsewhere in the region. Well, we'll be watching the events here, and we'll come to you with more links.